Now, I'm not saying that there are no controversies about generic drugs. While the FDA maintains that approved generic drugs are equivalent to their branded counterparts, bioequivalence problems have been reported by physicians, pharmacists, and patients for many drugs. Certain classes of drug are suspected to be particularly problematic because of their chemistry. Some of these include chiral drugs, poorly absorbed drugs, and cytotoxic drugs. And just to briefly brush on the surface of what are some of them, poorly absorbed drugs are drugs that are poorly absorbed. That means that their effect is harder to reach the therapeutic index to have an effect on the body. Chiral drugs are drugs that have a chiral center, which is they have different structure depending on their orientation. That can have different physical and chemical properties. Or naturally, the drugs itself is cytotoxic, means that they are harmful for the cell. In addition, complex delivery mechanism can cause bioequivalence to be a bit different. Physicians avoid switching patients from brand to generic or between different generic manufacturers when prescribing anti-epileptic drugs, warfarin, and other critical dose drugs. And let's talk about two stories about generic versus innovator drugs. Major issues were raised in the verification of bioequivalence when multiple generic versions of the FDA-approved generic drug were found to be not equivalent in efficacy and side effect profile. In 2007, two providers of consumer information on nutritional products and supplements, ConsumerLab.com and the People's Pharmacy, released the result of comparative tests of different brands of Wellbutrin. The People's Pharmacy received multiple reports of increased side effects and decreased efficacy of the generic Wellbutrin XL 300mg, which prompted to ask ConsumerLabs.com to test the products in question. And the test showed that some generic versions of Wellbutrin XL 300mg did not perform the same as the brand name pill in the laboratory test. FDA then investigated these complaints and concluded that the generic version is equivalent to the Wellbutrin XL in regard to the bioavailability of the budeprion XL 300mg and its main active metabolite, hydroxybupropion. FDA also said that the coincidental natural mood variation is likely to explain worsening of the depression after switching between Wellbutrin XL to budeprion XL. Then, after several years of denying patient reports, in 2012, FDA finally reversed this opinion, announcing that budeprion XL 300mg fails to demonstrate therapeutic equivalence to Wellbutrin XL 300mg. FDA did not test the bioequivalence of any of the generic version of the Wellbutrin XL 300mg, but requested that the four manufacturers submit data to the FDA by March 2013. As of October 2013, the FDA has made determination on the formulation for some of the manufacturers not being bioequivalent. And in the next story, in 2004, Ranbaxy was revealed to have been falsified data regarding the generic drugs they were manufacturing. As a result, 30 products were removed from the US market and Ranbaxy paid $500 million in fine. The FDA investigated many Indian drug manufacturers after this was discovered, and as a result, at least 12 companies have been banned from shipping drugs to the US. Now, one thing to note about these stories is that they are 1% of the 99 or 98% of all the drugs or processes that they have gone through the FDA. There are many different groups or project teams or administrative staff that work at FDA, and sometimes the data or information might have been missed. And so more often than not, it is not an intentional mistake. However, we also have to take into the fact that some manufacturers, for example in the case of Ranbaxy in India, are not honest and do not comply to all of the regulation and do not submit true data. And that's why FDA and other regulatory bodies constantly do audits to ensure that these data and the manufacturing practice are within the GMP and application standards. The point of talking about these controversies is to show that nothing is perfect, but majority of the process and application and procedures that regulatory body go through in large works and have prevented hundreds of thousands of drugs from releasing to the market that could potentially harm the public. And the bottom line is that 99.9% of the generic drugs are essentially the same as innovator drugs. They're safe to take, they cost less, and there are no differences in active pharmaceutical ingredients. Okay, a quick summary. We talked about innovator drugs versus generic drugs, their similarities and differences. We talked about the concept of bioequivalence and assessment to show that they, for all intent and purposes, are the same. We talked about the regulations surrounding bioequivalence. The regulations are there to protect the general public and not to harm them. And lastly, we talked about misconceptions and controversies about generic drugs, and that in most part and majority, they are very safe and effective.